Let me initiate the very first panel discussion for the day. The Mega Mammal Myopia, looking past the big stars of conservation. Through this discussion, we focus on sharing the spotlight with creatures that lie beyond the mega mammal spectrum. And for moderating this session, may I take the privilege of inviting Mr. Karthik Shankar. Ladies and gentlemen, can we have a huge round of applause for Mr. Karthik Shankar? Mr. Karthik Shankar is a professor at the Center for Ecological Sciences, IISc Bangalore, a renowned ecologist and author of the book From Soup to Superstar. And yes, everyone, we have with us Mr. Karthik Shankar. Over to you, sir.
Hi, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here. And true pleasure to invite my fellow panelists who probably didn't know that I was going to be introducing them. I'd like to invite Dr. Mahesh Rangarajan, India's premier environmental historian. His body of work speaks for itself. He's been writing about various issues relating to environment, conservation, and of course tigers that you heard about for several decades now. Mahesh is also a political commentator, formerly director of the Nehru Memorial Museum in Delhi, and has a list of accolades that would be unfair to expect me to remember at a moment's notice, but it's really a pleasure. Mahesh was also an inspiration for me personally in writing my book, as he was one of the people who encouraged me to do that. So welcome, Mahesh. I'd like to invite Dr. Rohan Arthur, India's premier marine conservationist and biologist. Rohan started diving before people knew it was a thing. And has spent the last several decades studying coral reefs in the Lakshadweep Islands and knows more about those reefs than anybody else. He's also worked on things that are associated with reefs and marine systems like, mega mammals like dugongs through his students. We'll talk more about that later, but Rohan's work in marine ecosystems has been extensive and has sort of laid the ground for many marine biologists and conservationists that have come afterwards. Is Sejal Mehta here? Oh, Sejal, you're right here. Sejal, welcome to Sejal Mehta. Please come on stage. Sejal is a marine conservationist and an author, and has for the last few years been a big part of marine life of Mumbai, and it's amazing that that we can still inspire interest in biodiversity, especially marine biodiversity, from the heart of cities such as Mumbai. So Sejal has done some amazing work with the organization, and I think we'll talk a little bit during the course of the panel about her book as well. So welcome Rohan, Sejal, and Mahesh, and I look forward to this session on mega mammal myopia. Do we have another mic, or a couple of them, if we could? So before we get started, the little blurb that we put together for this panel, which some of you may have read already, if it was out on social media. The theme of the panel is, are mega mammals really important for ecosystems? And sort of appropriately, the ground for this was set up by India's tiger doyen, Dr. Ullas Karanth. But the question we're going to ask is, are mega mammals really that important? Should they be central to our notion of environmental conservation, or do most conservationists just suffer from mammalloma, a disease which we coined as a myopic condition, where they obsess too much with pandas, elephants, and tigers, pets for short. So this is what we're going to debate today, and I want to start out by asking all of the panelists, does mega mammal myopia exist? All right, before I ask you guys, let me ask the audience, do you think, show of hands, do you think there's such a thing as mega mammal myopia, by which we mean that, that we're too obsessed with mega mammals and that we just sort of don't see the rest of biodiversity? Do you think that's a thing? I think we can leave. I mean, you know, there's everybody agrees. So, yeah. So does it exist, and you know, how much of a problem, you know, how serious do we think this issue of mega mammal myopia is? Mahesh,
How serious is the issue of mega mammal myopia? It depends on who's doing the thinking. And it depends on whether we are capable of rethinking anything. I am a student of history. I am not a biologist. I don't know the difference between biologists and historians, or between natural and social science. But one of the differences, historians cannot predict the future. We can explain why we got here. So I'd like to ask, is there mega mammal myopia? And the answer will be a yes and a no, because any complex answer has a yes and a no. So if you look at India, since Dr. Karanth inaugurated us, got us to a flying start, I think around 55 years ago, there was deep concern about the extinction of the tiger. And something extraordinary happened in 1972. The tiger became Indian. Before that in India, the government called it the Bengal tiger. In West Bengal and Bangladesh, which had yet to be born, they still call it the Royal Bengal tiger. But in India, it became the Indian tiger. And one reason the tiger got saved was not because it was becoming extinct, it was seen as a symbol of India. So in my previous job, Karthik referred to it, I had the distinction of working for a man called Dr. Singh, Dr. Karan Singh. Singh, for those who don't know, means lion. So very lucky man, because his nickname was Tiger. And he was asked, is it true that the tiger has become national animal because your nickname is Tiger? And he said, no. He said one reason is the tiger is a symbol of unity in diversity. The tiger is in 11 states of India, while the lion is found in only one state of India. You know what happened the same year? Gujarat declared the lion its state animal. So the lion became Gujarati and the tiger became Indian. Now, one of the positives, since Dr. Karan talked about tigers, I've done some work on lions, is in the late 60s, there were about 180 lions. 177 for those who like numbers. They went and counted their pug marks, whether this was scientific or not, and they started protecting them. Now, 2 days ago, the statement of Gujarat government says there are 734 lions, the very exact figures. But the interesting thing is they're found in 10 districts of Gujarat. There are lions in places like Porbandar. You all know who was born in Porbandar? Mahatma Gandhi. So Porbandar got its first lion walking in last month. There's a lion roaming around outskirts of Porbandar now. So one answer is whether we are mega mammal myopic or not, there are mega mammals well beyond these protected areas. And the other point is the tiger didn't get protected only because it became the national animal. The concern about the tiger was paralleled by a larger concern about the environment. But on terrestrial environments, it's about something called deforestation. You lop off the forest, replace it with something else. So I think there have been great accomplishments over the last 50 years around the tiger and mega mammals, great accomplishments about the forest, and like all superstars, it casts a shadow. You start looking at the tiger and other mega mammals, the forest and its associated systems, and as a student of history, I'm struck, when we look at the larger environmental question, so much of it is beyond the forest, beyond the tiger. So I think like all things, it had its pluses, but it had its shadow. And it's time we look at why and look beyond the shadow. Thank you.
Sejal, go ahead.
Thank you for putting that so beautifully. So my perspective will be slightly from a writer's perspective and somebody who consumes information about wildlife, large mammals, small mammals, all of those things. And I think what he said, some of it I think I'd agree with, in the sense that when all of us, I think when we started watching, reading, interacting, engaging with literature or movies or anything about wildlife, all of us remember the big names. We remember claws, we remember teeth, we remember sharks, we remember also in a quite terrible manner, because Jaws did for sharks what, people are still cleaning up that mess. But what I'm trying to say is that I think all of us, the gateway into at least storytelling. So I wouldn't call it myopia, but definitely I think And I'm also a case study in that, because I started with the big moments, and most of us start with the big moments, right? What's your first interaction as a child? You'll go outside, you look here, there, they'll say, chalo zoo chalte hain, chalo national park chalte hain, chalo safari karte hain. These are your introductions to the wildlife. If you're lucky enough, then, and if you have great educators around you, you will already start looking at small creatures. But I think largely, as an audience, we go for the big stuff. We both go for the big moments, as they put it, in a certain format, told in this beautiful baritone of David Attenborough, and all of those things, right? We've grown up with this. So while I'll say yes, in storytelling also that existed, but I think the idea of that is also changing. So for example, I'm sure you, I don't know, anybody, do you know SpongeBob SquarePants? Right? Now that really strange creature is a result of a shore walk done by a scientist, biologist, and creator. And he looked at this weird sessile creature which looks like a plant and said, this is going to be the hero of my next show. And that's how a sea sponge became as big as a large mammal in terms of storytelling. So while that myopia exists, I think it's also the lens with which you look at a creature and think, can it be as charismatic or not?
Can I switch the question around for you a little bit? Yeah. Before I throw you off the deep end as an ecologist, Rohan, I think the point bears sort of like emphasis that many of our role models also, they came at a time when large mammals or large vertebrates were focal, and they kind of became our original sort of, they were our idols, they were our inspiration. So, Ullas Karant with tigers, Ravi Challam with lions, Sukumar with elephants. Many people came into the field, or A.J.T. Johnson with, like a wider sort of spread of, mammalian work, and sort of drew people into the field, and in a way those role models then, not just the species themselves, the role models also cast a shadow that many people on this panel have sort of like emerged from. But I think the question, that both Sejal has been answered quite nicely by both Sejal and Mahesh in terms of whether large mammal, whether mega mammal myopia exists or why. Rohan, I think, as an ecologist, as we're both sort of the ecologists on this panel, I think it's important to ask whether that's ecologically justified, as many authors have made it out to be. You need to protect tigers to protect forests. You need to protect dolphins to protect oceans. I know you really love dolphins. You have the special term for them. May I? Rohan calls them smiling cretins. Cretins. And he also loves marine turtles. I mean, I work extensively on turtles. He's worked more on green turtles in the Lakshadweep than I have, but he insists on calling them those things that eat my seagrass. Okay, so given your love of large vertebrates, there is a case that's been made in literature and in conservation that these are really central to ecosystem function, that they're the keystone species, that, if we didn't conserve them, ecosystems would fall apart. As an ecologist, what is your take on this justification for the myopia?
So, thanks, Karthik. I think, first of all, I think I've spent much too much time with my face in the water. And so when I look for this myopia in the water, I don't see it as much in the terrestrial as in the terrestrial systems. And part of that, of course, is that you have 5,500 mammals. Only about 130 of them are marine. Of course, all the ones that are marine are large. The largest mammals will be in the sea. But we have less than 2% of the mammals altogether in the sea. And so, of course, they get a bit of a disproportionate emphasis, of course. And of course, this idea that many of these large mammals play extremely important functional roles, I think to some extent it is true. I think it plays, much of that though, I think bears much more validation. And particularly in the systems that I study, whether it is seagrass meadows or coral reefs or kelp beds and things like that, there seems to be, it's almost a given that these large predators play important roles. But for instance, when you start looking more closely, you'll start looking at, for instance, the important role that sharks play. Sharks are not marine mammals, of course. but they're large, charismatic creatures. And you find that they're not as important as all of that. You take sharks away and function performs fairly well, right? What tends to be important are much, for instance, in the coral reef, the most important thing to hold the system together are herbivores. And you have a huge number of herbivores that you can take a few of them out and the function will still be maintained. So we need to, I think, trouble this idea that single species, at the top of these trophic pyramids, hold everything together. This idea of the keystone, I think, is a very powerful idea, but it does need a little bit more validation in all the systems that we have. I think what tends to happen is that we find these post hoc rationalizations for saving large charismatic animals, and we use them as flagships, but often by trying to focus such a lot on the flagship, we forget completely about the fleet. So I think that we need to think about the larger fleet as well.
Thanks, Rohan. That's really well said. I mean, I think, I'd like to push on that for a moment longer. And, you said it politely, but I think to kind of like put it bluntly, there's much less evidence that these animals are actual keystones than conservationists make them out to be. And that's certainly true of the mega vertebrates that I've spent much of my life working on turtles, which brings us to another point, which is that it's one thing to say that they actually don't have the impact that we think they do, but there are also instances where they have a negative impact, right? And I can sort of give the example of elephants, which in many forests have actually dramatically changed community composition and structure to an extent that ecosystem function has actually declined. Perhaps you can speak about that example. Again, they're not mammals, but they're megavertebrates, and perhaps briefly about what those things have done to your seagrass.
You put me on the spot here, but I mean,
I agree with you, by the way. I mean, yeah.
Right. So this, I think, takes us into a slightly tricky area. That often with enthusiastic conservation efforts, we can actually make a big difference. And I think that's actually a great positive message, that you can have, you can build a campaign around conserving species and you can be very, very successful about it. But if you start thinking about conserving species without thinking about their role within the larger ecosystem, you can often create these secondary effects that can actually be quite devastating. And so what we have been documenting in the Lakshadweep is, as a result of this really successful conservation of green turtles across the Indian Ocean, where it's one of those big success stories, I would think, of conservation in general. And it has really generated a huge amount of enthusiasm for marine wildlife, etc. And I think it is, it has seen the birth of a whole lot of conservationists who started off their life doing turtle walks and all the rest of it. But species like green turtles require forage. They require places, they require food to eat. And so they find themselves in seagrass meadows like the ones in the Lakshadweep, and within about 10 years, they've caused a functional extinction of all the seagrass meadows within the Lakshadweep ecosystem. And so the question that you ask is, we keep talking about these pristine spaces which need to be kept aside for nature. The question is, what exactly is the nature of that pristine? And who gets to decide what those baselines look like? It's very clear that if we were to try to get populations of green turtles at anything like pristine levels, it might mean the death of all ecosystems that they depend on. And so there's a certain, we need to, again, trouble those narratives a little bit more and try and understand them a little bit more.
Yeah, I was going to lead into the next question, Mahesh, which you can respond to that one directly, or really, I think we're leading into that part about, sure, biologists, ecologists, conservationists have been biased by their own sort of like passions, but what is it? I think we're starting to sort of question, what does that mean for conservation, right? So go ahead.
No, one of the ways, since you are looking at mega mammals, is in '72, for the first time, India decided to count, not the number of people. We'd been doing that from the 80s. There's a census of humans held every 10 years. They didn't hold one in 21. India decided to count the number of tigers. And it came up with a magic number. I'm very struck by government numbers. They're very exact. 1827. It's an exact number, right? Not 1828, 1826. And there's a huge debate on how to count tigers and what you should estimate. I don't want to go there. I want to make a different point. It's a fascinating paper. I try to think which is the most interesting thing I've read. And there are lots of books, but there's a short article. It's a brilliant piece. It's called The Tiger and the Honeybee. This was an anthropologist around 30 years ago. He goes to Simlipal Tiger Reserve and he discovers that the Tiger Reserve assesses success by how many tigers there are, right? More tigers, better Tiger Reserve. Tigers are happy. They are eating sambar and cheetal and wild boars and they're having cubs and the cubs are growing up and the numbers are growing. But he found that the people who lived there, called the Hill Maria, told him they had their way of assessing the health of the forest. And he said they don't look at the number of tigers. By the way, they don't hunt animals. They don't kill lots of animals. They've never hunted tigers. They assess the health of the forest by the taste of the honey. He says, what do you mean by that? They said in this large, vast forest, there are things called madhu bandars. Sounds fascinating, but I'm sure it's very dangerous if you go too close to it. There are these giant clusters of beehives. So he said, what's the difference? He said they said there are different types of flowers and trees in the different parts of the forest. And depending on the flowers and the trees, even the same bee makes a honey which tastes different. So they harvest the honey and they assess the health of the forest by the size of the madhu bandar and the taste of the honey. Now, you've got to be very careful. Everyone living there was not a Hill Maria. Everyone didn't harvest honey. But please note, they assess the health of the forest in terms of pollinator, not the predator. And they hadn't read the Coca-Cola ad. So this is a very evil thing. Since there are youngsters who don't drink lots of it, but you should know the ad. It was called Coca-Cola, taste not size. Well, the Hill Marias could have said size not taste. You know, the taste of the honey, not the size of the tiger. And he then argues there are peoples who live with productive systems that draw on nature without destroying it. Now, they do harvest the honey. I'm sure they use fire. Some bees get killed. But they don't disturb the bandar. The hive producing group remains intact. So does the forest. And Sabyasachi argued, can we change the way we look at the forest, not only in terms of the tiger and the honeybee, but of who relates to nature and how? So I think one of the unfortunate consequences of this model of conservation, set aside 5% of the land, 10% of the land, 20% of the land, whatever, is we don't realize we need a different way of relating to the land, the water, the air, the plants, the hydrology. And perhaps we need to rethink that as much as we question which creature to look at.
Yeah, thanks, Mahesh. That's really, I think, central because it sort of brought out for us the rather narrow way in which we achieve, in which we sort of like think about conservation itself. Sejal, I mean, you sort of spent years working, with marine critters and wrote about them, and I guess one way to ask the question is, why did you feel there was a need for that? What was the perspective of conservation that you were seeing in India at the time, and what brought you to the kind of work that you did?
So, it's a weird sort of foray into the intertidal space in that sense. So, I've been an editor for magazines and worked in different types of publishing before. And as an editor also, and as a writer also, I've been guilty of pushing a certain narrative, right? Because it's lack of knowledge, it's nothing else. There's no ill intent, it's just what is available, what you see, what your role models are doing, as you said, when we were growing up. So our papers, our magazines, all information was full of things that I said earlier in the earlier answer. But when I was the editor at NIF, Teacher in Focus, and I'm a Bombay girl, and is this better? And I was living in Bangalore, and I started to, somebody pitched a story to me about wildlife on Bombay's very polluted shores. Now all my writer's skepticism came to the fore, and I was like, have you seen Juhu Beach? Like, have you gone to Bandra? There are more people there than a Beyonce concert on any given day. No self-respecting wildlife will ever want to, be around. So I was like, nahi, nahi, ye to, they've got some very excited about ek do crab dekh liya and that they are excited about it. So I dismissed it, but of course as a writer, I wanted to go and see. So on my next visit to Bombay, I went for a walk with Abhishek Jamalabad. He's one of the founders of Marine Life of Mumbai. And I had to eat a lot of humble pie because I realized that our coastlines, not just in Bombay, but across the country and across the world, were literally brimming with stories to be told and creatures that were magnificent. And the reason I thought that this particular space perhaps needed that lens, because it's largely invisible, right? When you think of an intertidal zone, does anybody know what it is? What an intertidal zone is? It's a patch of land that is covered at high tide and revealed at low tide. So you don't really think about that space much at all, right? Because it's largely invisible in a day. And if you live in Bombay, then you take the ocean for granted in a way that you will not even take your own family for granted. It's so vast, but you forget about it. But when you look at this space, now consider, Karthik, I'll put that to you only, consider this place for a home, right? There's harsh sunlight through the day. There's cool moonlight in the night. There's predators in the shallows. There's predators from the land. There's an endless cycle of impermanence, right? The tide comes in, ebb and flow of saline water. You build a house, tide comes in, it's gone. Build a house, tide comes in, it's gone. It's an endless cycle of impermanence. It's a tough space to live in. So when I was looking at that piece of land, and it's not just about the intertidal zone, I use that as a reference for all spaces that might be invisible and animals that you might not normally see. And I realized that if the space is so special, then perhaps the creatures who lived here might operate on some level that I may not be aware of. And so started a relationship with that coast. It started from Bombay. And I realized that there are creatures that live here which survive with superpowers that you can only, marvel at. And that's how everything sort of, and the reason to write it in a weird way was because at that time Bombay's coasts were experiencing some sort of turbulence in terms of infrastructure projects that were coming up, the coastal road was being built, all of those things was happening in Bombay. And Marine Life of Mumbai kind of started to just create awareness. Basically to just cast some sort of light on this invisible, largely invisible space. And I also realized that another reason to push this kind of writing is also when you, and now I'm on the other side, right? I was the editor, now I'm a writer, and I freelance sometimes. And I also realized that the space in mainstream media is at the same time blossoming in terms of wildlife writing, but also shrinking. So when I say, okay, can I write about the cone snail? And she'll say, why don't you write about the dolphin? Because that's far more, people, more eyeballs, more clicks, more on, or all of these things. But then I realized that actually it's just how you write about the creature, right? So I'm going to take a small little 2 minutes and tell you why something that you don't think as charismatic can become super charismatic. Okay, there is a creature, and I've written this book a while ago, and I'm sitting with 2 stalwarts here who tried marine. So if I'm wrong, please correct me. But if I remember, I wrote the book and my niece took a test on the book and I flunked it. So I just want to say that I don't remember a lot of what I've written. But there is a creature on our coastlines called the cone snail. When you look at the cone snail, it's this much or this much, depending on the size, but it looks like a cone. It's very unassuming. But then I asked about it. And so the cone snail hunts in a really amazing manner. It's like a ninja assassin, right? It has a proboscis. And inside that, it has a harpoon, okay? Now with this harpoon, it sort of shoots it at a fish, reels it in, and swallows it whole. Now you think, yeah, that's pretty cool, but that's not enough. That's not enough. The harpoon is laced with venom. So when it kind of shoots it, it paralyzes its prey, reels it in, and eats it up. You think, wow, that's pretty cool. Still not enough. So this cone snail, like a lot of other snails, has teeth that replace itself. So this harpoon is basically a tooth, right? Tooth laced with venom. It shoots it. And how many of you know Hawkeye from the Avengers? Do you know? Right? So Hawkeye's main flex is that he never runs out of arrows. Now, if a cone snail and hawkeye would have a conversation, cone snail would be like, bro, hold my beer. Because the cone snail shoots a harpoon, and in its place, just like, those bottles in conveyor belts in factories where they kind of get stamped with their caps, when it shoots it, another harpoon laced with venom, ready to shoot, takes its place. So you think, whoa, that's amazing. But then you think, that's also not enough. There's more to this creature. And this cone, the cone snail, and of course this varies with species, okay? Not every cone snail will have these abilities. But the cone snail has different types of toxins, right? It's like a little laboratory in itself. So it has different types of venom that it kind of concocts to attack or to defend. So it actually chooses how it wants to attack or defend. You think, wow, that's really cool and this is amazing. But there's so many different types of toxins that it uses. I think if I'm at last count, it was around 250 different types of neurotoxins. And there are around 250 types of snails, I think, cone snails, which comes to around like, how much? Like 250,000, 5 lakh type of toxins that are now there, which they are armed with. So there is really no antidote. And that, of course, it's not really harmful for us. Only one species, I think the geography cone, is harmful to humans. But this is, of course, they use it for other creatures. But now think about it. This kind of superpower was sitting in Bombay's beaches, shores, rocky shores, and we had no clue. So that's a lot of scientists will say, right? If you see a cone, you leave it alone. So this kind of superpower and this kind of charismatic tail, now suddenly this creature, which is like this tiny little thing which you wouldn't look at, has become on par, I would think, with a really great story about how a tiger hunts, or a cheetah would attack, or like a falcon would, sort of dive. This kind of information which exists about this creature suddenly makes your shore come alive. It's not about that one species. Then it's like, wow, what else is there? And there are many other creatures, of course, like that. And then you think that, like a hermit crab. Now this we'll argue and say, I'll argue my own point and say, but this is look at the superpower. Not all animals are so cool, right? Like a hermit crab, for example. Hermit crabs, they're very bichara. I'm from Bombay, I really relate with these creatures because there are a lot of them. They are not true crabs. They're very soft, they don't have hard carapaces like other crabs because they're not true crabs. They use shells that are abandoned by other snails and carry them and stagger across the intertidal with that. And, otherwise they'll probably die from the heat or whatever. They have to protect themselves. Now these snails, and that's not all. There are a lot of them, so immediately I think of a Bombay local train when I see like a whole line of them and they're fighting with each other, they're sitting over each other. There are always many, many, many of them. And then and then you think about that it's not enough. Like they'll grow out of their shell and then they have to get a bigger shell. It's like always a bigger, better real estate opportunity is always on the horizon from this creature. Now how much more Bombay can you get? So when you say these things to people and then they look at the hermit crab, immediately there is empathy. You're like, oh, this is not a cool creature in the way the cone snail is, right? It's like you and I. But I think in that sense, that lens is why I was obsessed with telling the story for this space, the creatures, and this largely invisible thing which I wanted it to come alive for people.
Thanks, Sejal. If you keep this up, they're going to have to organize a session on intertidal myopia next. You're like, we are focusing too much on intertidal creatures. There are other things. So, Rohan, as a conservationist, what do you think? The focus on, of course, mega mammals is kind of the center of our discussion today. But sort of these mega things, what kind of impact do you think that has had on the way we approach conservation? And you spoke about that a little bit, but perhaps you could elaborate on that. And this is one example of the kind of attention that they grab. I work on sea turtles. There are 7 species of sea turtles, and 1,000 people attend a sea turtle conference, right? There are several hundred species of freshwater turtles, and half the number of species attend those conferences. So we're like some groups get one biologist per 100 species and other groups get 100 biologists per one species, So, yeah. But what effect does it have on our real world engagement with environmental conservation?
I mean, that's difficult to say, but I think one of the things I've been thinking about is that the focus on mammals and on large mammals to begin with, I think constrains the way, the creative possibilities that Sejal was talking about the creative possibilities of life and creative possibilities of engagement that all of diversity actually provides you. Every little creature has so many different ways of engaging. And I think one thing that does tend to take place is that by focusing a lot on mammals, we tend to focus on species assemblages that are driven by negative interactions, I suspect. So predation plays an extremely important role. Competition plays an extremely important role. But when you start looking at coral reefs, for instance, or seagrass meadows, or many of these other systems, you find that there are a whole lot of these caring mechanisms of facilitation, of symbioses, that become really, really critical in holding these ecosystems together. And I think that these positive relationships give us, I think, examples for living as well, which I think that we've thought very, very much of nature red in tooth and claw, but there's a whole lot of the other biology of this, of assemblages, of communities, that are held together by relationships that are much, much more facilitative and much more positive. And I think that itself changes the way we look at nature. And I think it also changes the way we think of ourselves as being separate or embedded within that. And so I think the myopia has that, that's one of the dangers, I think, of myopia. It, first of all, creates us as separate from nature, and it limits from us, I think, the possibility of seeing a much, much more creative way of engagement, which nature actually does. Okay? So that's, I think, I'm not sure if that's exactly answering your question, but it goes some way.
I think so. Mahesh, would you like to comment on that as well?
Yeah, so let me go back to the large mammals. I was just thinking of something. One of the people I grew up on was a very great singer who died young called Mohammed Rafi. I don't know how many people have heard of him. So he sang a song for a very important film called Hathi Mere Sathi, which is, by the way, a Hindi remake of a Tamil film, except the Hindi film had an actor, Rajesh Khanna. It is rumored after this film, Rajesh Khanna was asked, what did you say about the film? He didn't say this, but it's such a nice story, we wish it's true. He said, I'm willing to act with actors, actresses. I will not work with an animal anymore. Because in the film, there's an elephant called Ramu, and he dies saving Rajesh Khanna. And it's an incredible scene. Rajesh Khanna did something only he could do. Don't attempt it. There's a cart. This elephant is lying down as if it's dead. I mean, it was an actor after all. And he's pulling it alone. And he's also singing a song. It's a very famous song. Its first line, I'll tell you, it's called Nafrat ki duniya ko chhodkar pyar ki duniya mein. We've left the world of hate and entered the world of love. And it's very beautiful lines. I'll translate it because all of you are not Hindi speakers. He says that, when an animal kills a human being, the whole world blames it and abuses it. Here is an innocent animal which has been killed. Why is it aap sab itne bedard? Why are you so heartless? So I think one of the functions of environmentalism, nature conservation, it didn't depend which animal you picked. It happened to be an elephant, but it drew on that animal to send a larger message, which I think Sejal did brilliantly. I was reminded when Sejal was talking of Rachel Carson's work, Under the Sea Wind. You take an animal, a plant, or a bird, or a place, and you evoke a larger sense of wonder, which gives you a sense of humility. You understand there's something special about something other than me or us. And I do want to say that over the last many years, many states in India have thought of it. I was thinking, Tamil Nadu has a very interesting state tree. It's the Palmyra palm. See, 40-45% of Tamil Nadu is semi-arid. By the way, 40-45% of India is semi-arid. You cannot live in a semi-arid landscape without trees. Some of the trees which have been cultured by people also help certain kinds of biodiversity. So it's unlikely you'll find a tiger hiding a Palmyra palm thicket. I'm sure you won't. But Palmyra palm is used to fence the fields. It naturally grows. It keeps out cattle. There's a host of small mammals, birds, reptiles, which live in Palmyra palm. So I would like us to think of a larger living landscape in which large mammals are embedded. They are a part of it. There may be certain zones where you don't have certain activities so that they can live. But they're not going to live only in those landscapes. They're going to come out of them. And hey, people are not going to live only outside the landscapes. They're also going to the landscapes. So I think, the mega mammal is fine as long as it is part of this larger sense of wonder and humility. But this sense of wonder and humility, we should also respect people who through practices renature and provide space for landscapes. Dr. Nagendra is in the audience. She authored a wonderful book with her colleague in Azim Premji University, Cities and Canopies. My favorite tree in that book was one which reminded me of a food. The murunka sambar. You make sambar with murunka. Murunka is a fascinating tree and no institution I'm in wants to plant it. All the people from the gardeners to people will say don't plant it because they said if you plant murunka in Tamil you call it kambli puchi. It's a very unscientific term. These caterpillars, they all come. But this murunka is remarkable. It flowers at different times of the year. It brings lots of sunbirds and it supports a lot of insects. So one is we should look beyond mega mammals. We're fine with mega mammals if they make us think of the larger whole. And anything can make you think of the larger whole. This murunka and palmara palm are also important, not only the tiger, elephant, and sorry, Rohan, the turtle.
Sorry, me, the turtle. How much time do we have left? It's 10 minutes, okay. I think we'll go to the audience. I just wanted a very quick kind of like, maybe or maybe we'll have a quick sort of like closing comment after we've taken some audience questions actually. I really like the point that both of you just made about the sense of humans and nature not being, being separate, deriving from a particular view, not just of conservation as a whole or nature as a whole, but in a sense, a particular interpretation of our relationship with large mammals. We come into conflict with elephants, we come into conflict with tigers, we come into conflict with other mega things like crocodiles. And the idea that coexistence is not possible itself deriving from a smaller set of species that we were, focused on. So I think all of them have made some really nice points. I think we'll take a few questions or comments from the audience before we do a quick wrap up. Does anyone have any questions that particularly would put any of them on the spot?
Hi. That's okay. Hi, Karthik. Hi, Mahesh. Swarna here. Am I too close to this? Okay. In front of me as somebody who's layman, who's sort of come in and out of wildlife. I'm no researcher, I'm no biologist, but I have three realities in front of me. One for me is humans are the top predators. Okay, at any given choice, if humans will take to destructions so that there is something that they can, because the earth is theirs, they don't see it as. The second reality is that whatever said and done, the mega mammals have this charisma, have this ability to attract attention. And third, what Sejal said was about eyeballs, right? So you have this media we need to talk to who can take the larger message to the larger populace, because we are dealing with poverty, we're dealing with all kinds of other problems. So really small species don't matter in this whole thing because we are used to crushing them, we are used to crushing the big ones as well. So if you have these three realities in front of me, I really think the one way to look at it is to see how you can thread the smaller species and the larger ecosystem through the eyes and the lens of the big mammals. And somehow, while this audience is really touched about humility and being part of the whole nature and not outside it, but I just feel for a larger movement to happen, somewhere that kind of a thread to bring in the smaller species through the big one's eyes is what it is not either or. I don't know if I'm right, but this is what I'm coming as. So I just thought I'll ask you what's your take on that.
So let me take the three animals on the 10 rupee note. You have a 10 rupee note? There's elephant, tiger, rhino. Elephant range in India is less than 200,000 square kilometers. Tiger range is probably 300,000 square kilometers. Rhino is found, I don't know the number, less than 100,000 square kilometers. These are remarkable animals. We'd love to have them around. But there's a large part of India where they're not found. It's very simple. We have to look at the larger living landscape. We can have more and more rhinos, more and more elephants, more and more tigers. I actually disagree with the idea that these are very important, but they indicate certain things. There are lots of things they can't indicate. We may use up our groundwater, we may destroy, the mangroves, and we may still have lots of tigers, lot of rhinos, lot of elephants. So my submission is, look at the larger picture as well. I'm in sympathy with your argument. So big is beautiful, small is also beautiful. We need to look at big and small. We shouldn't make it big or small. Thanks.
Yeah. We're going to take that, maybe that in a second. But I'm going to actually answer, not on Sejal's behalf, but I think, I think Sejal actually proves that that point is not true, right? That people have used large mammals as flagships, but if you talk about smaller animals the way that she has, I think they have an equal capacity to fire human imagination. So I think as much as conservation, the literary engagement with the public has been lacking in imagination in a way. And that's why we are where you're calling it a reality, but it need not be one, I think. And Rohan's a shining example, perhaps. How do you think that applies to marine ecosystems at all?
If it's about making a case for the smaller creatures of the world, I think that literature in particular, I think, does play an important role. And we're here at the Literary Festival and it's a testament to that. The book that got me into wildlife in the first place was actually a book written by John Steinbeck about the log from the Sea of Cortez, where he goes along with the biologist Ed Ricketts in the Gulf of Mexico, collecting little creatures and basically describing them. And he says that he went to the sea to live naturally and to see things as they are. And it was really, truly inspirational. And none of the big creatures were there in that book at all. But he described to me in the most evocative ways, in ways that we biologists find very difficult. And I think as conservationists as well, I don't think we do a very good job of of inspiring people. But I think people whose job it is to write can do a much, much better job about inspiring people about nature in its broadest possible sense. And so I think that there is a case to be made for embedding nature in in all its diversity into the literature we read.
Sorry. Dr. Karanth does give Mrs. Gandhi the credit for wanting to protect the tiger, but at the end of the day, before she died, all she wanted to see was the trees of Kashmir, So it was, her desire to save the tiger was actually a more holistic approach on its desire to save the country's ecology, I think somewhere we've got it a bit wrong that she was obsessed with the tiger, I think we have to think beyond that.
Sorry, I can't resist. See, 1973, when Project Tiger is launched, May 73 is the first actual Chipko protest in Rainy, all right? So there's a larger tradition also. Some leaders can listen with their left ear. Maybe Mrs. Gandhi did sometimes. But I think there's a larger environmental concern, and I'd be very worried if, ma'am, in spirit of your question, nature preservation set itself apart from the larger environmental movement. They need to infuse each other with insight. We need green renewable energy. We put in so many windmills, the bustard will get wiped out. We do need spaces for the bustard, but for spaces for the bustard, those lands can be used for grazing because bustards need a closed area only for a few weeks a year. So I think this larger holistic notion and the idea of preservation of nature, big or small, we need to dialogue with each other. This is not a time to make fractions of what is already a very embattled worldview.
We have time for one more question, or we are out of time? I think we're out. We have a minute. We have a minute for a last question. The audience agrees with us. So, well, in that case, I think we'll, I'll thank all of the panelists for their wonderful insights, ecological and literary and historical. And I'll end by expanding on something that Rohan said. There's a quote from one of Arthur Conan Doyle's book where there's a conversation between Holmes and Watson. And at the end of that conversation, Holmes says to Watson, he says, Watson, our ideas have to be as broad as nature if we are to understand it. And I kind of paraphrase that by saying, our ideas have to be as broad as nature if we are to conserve it. Thank you very much.
Well, what an insightful panel discussion that was, from perspectives coming from the scientist, the author, the historian, and I am so sure that audience might have enjoyed this exchange of knowledge that we just witnessed. With that being said, let me take this moment to request our moderator, Mr. Karthik Shankar, to felicitate our speakers for this panel. And yes, everyone, can we have a huge round of applause for all the speakers? Thank you so much for gracing us in this festival. We have Mr. Karthik Shankar, the moderator of this session, presenting a token of gratitude to our speakers. Thank you so much, but please do remain on the stage. And now may I take this opportunity to invite Mr. Benedict Paramanand onto the stage, the founder of GLF, to felicitate the moderator, Mr. Karthik Shankar. Yes, a huge round of applause for him, please. As they are posing for a photograph, let me invite the students of Parikrama School to kindly join us on the stage, because we do have, I request the speakers to remain on the stage. I request the speakers to be on the stage. We do have a very special gift which is being prepared by the students of Parikrama School. It is nothing other than a handmade card. So yes, let's all appreciate all those efforts that these students have put into making these cards, and they're gifting them. So thank you so much again to the students of Parikrama School. Can we have a group photograph with them? Well, thank you so much, everyone.